Okay, so now we are beginning our second week, and we are going to be talking this week about two topics. One is cultural relativism, the other is religion and morality. So, one common way of understanding morality is that morality is simply rules of a particular culture. Textbook has the example of the beginning about how Greeks practiced cremation, and the Galatians who lived in India ate the bodies of their dead fathers. Probably a note that that might not be true. We're getting that from uh, Western historians in the ancient world, so quite likely not true. But anyhow, we can imagine a culture that eats their own dead bodies. Is one of these acts wrong and the other one right? Well, in one sense, who are we to make that claim? That's the sort of standard line of thinking. And a lot of times when you press people for answers, you say, well, why is gay marriage wrong? Or why is abortion wrong? Or why is murder wrong? Or why is smoking marijuana wrong, but drinking alcohol is perfectly fine? A lot of times you get some version of, well, that's what I learned, or that's what the law is, that's what our culture is okay, or that's what my parents taught me, something like that. So it's called relativism because what it does is it makes morality relative to a particular culture, right? So um, eating your dead fathers, I think it was, is morally right relative to this culture, the Galatians, and morally wrong relative to the ancient Greeks, whereas burning your father is morally right for the Greeks relative to the Greeks culture and morally wrong relative to Galatian culture. The other example it's given is infanticide. The Eskimos practiced infanticide. So that would be that infanticide is morally wrong relative to Western culture, but morally right relative to Eskimo culture. So we get a reconstruction in section 2.3 of the argument for the cultural differences argument. And he gives a couple versions based on the two examples I just gave, and then he gives a general version of the argument. So the first premise of this argument is that different cultures have different moral codes. The conclusion is that there is no objective truth in morality. Right and wrong are only matters of opinion, and opinions vary from culture to culture. So the second, number two, the second premise is supposed to be a conclusion of an argument. Now, an argument, for it to work, it must be sound, which means that all the premises have to be true. So that first premise in this argument, different cultures have different moral codes. Well, that is a true premise. The argument's sound, but it also has to be valid. That means it has to be in the right logical form. And this course, we're not talking about what those right logical forms are, but that's just something to note, that arguments have to be in the right logical form for them to make sense. If this argument is not in the right logical form, there's no logical connection between the first premise and the second premise. So the argument itself fails. Okay, there's no logical connection between the idea that there are different moral codes in different cultures and that there's no one right moral code, right? So to use an example, different cultures had different beliefs about the origin of the universe. Does that mean there's no right answer about the origin of the universe? No, that would be ridiculous, right? So just because different people believe different things about something, it doesn't mean that there's no right answer. We don't infer from disagreement that there is no answer. Joe might think the moon is made of blue cheese, and I think it's made out of rocks or whatever it's made out of, but doesn't mean that there's no answer to that question, or that the truth of the matter is relative to whoever's speaking about it. Okay, so that argument was bad, but how can we go further in evaluating the position of cultural relativism? So what Rachels does is essentially he looks at some various sort of consequences, or what would follow from cultural relativism. So that's to say, if cultural relativism is true, what else would be true? So if cultural relativism is true, this is section 2.4, he says, 1, we can no longer say that the customs of other societies are morally inferior to our own. 2, we can no longer criticize the code of our own society. And 3, the idea of moral progress is called into doubt. So these are all very problematic implications for moral realism or moral cultural relativism. So the first one, we can no longer say the customs of other societies are morally inferior to our own. We don't need to. Our own there is not important, but the real point here is we can no longer say that one culture's practice is better or worse than another one, right? So in the modern world, we think that women have a right to vote. There are still countries in which women don't have a right to vote. Okay, we want to be able to say it's wrong, all women should have a right to vote. Or we want to say that people should not be stoned to death for adultery. Um, so we want to be able to say that some cultures have gotten things wrong. And if cultural relativism is true, we can't say that. We can't say that we just have to say that's perfectly fine for you. In your culture, if you kill people for having sex with members of their own gender, then that's okay. You do whatever you want. You have your culture, we have ours, that's fine. But generally, we don't believe that. We think some ideas, some cultures are good and some are bad. And not to say one culture is better than every other culture, but every culture has a mix of good and bad. And we want to be able to say this is good in this culture, that's bad in this culture, this is good in this culture, that's bad. So it's problematic that we can't do that if cultural relativism is true. If cultural relativism is true, we can no longer criticize the code of our own society, right? So maybe we think marijuana should be decriminalized, but if cultural relativism is true, there's no real way to say that because what we want to say is it's wrong for marijuana to be illegal, but if it's illegal, by definition, if it's right. That's what cultural relativism is. Whatever the current cultural standard is, then that makes it right. And the third idea is that moral progress is called into doubt. So we generally think that societies can make progress. We think that it was a form of moral progress when we abolished slavery in the United States, right? But if cultural relativism is true, there's no such thing as moral progress because right and wrong is just defined by your culture. So one culture, it's kind of like the problem of comparing cultures, but instead of comparing one culture now with another culture, current culture across the world, we're comparing one culture with itself at a previous point in time. So we want to say American culture has made progress. It's good that women now have a right to vote in America. It's good that slavery is not legal. It's good that people of different races can get married. It's good that schools are no longer segregated. It's good that children can now get an education instead of being forced to work in factories, things like that. Child labor is banned. It's good that we have minimum wage, all kinds of laws. We want to say those were progress, right? And if cultural relativism is true, then there's no such thing as moral progress because right and wrong is just whatever your culture says, and you can never make progress. There's no moral idea to progress to. Every standard, every cultural standard at every point in time is as good as any other standard. So because of considerations like that, philosophers and people who have thought about morality have thought that really can't be the nature of morality. When we talk about right and wrong, we don't just mean what your culture says, because if that were true, then we couldn't ever make claims like slavery is wrong. What we want to say is slavery is wrong in all places, in all times, in all societies, in all cultures. Anyone who practices slavery is wrong. Anyone who kills someone else for no reason is wrong to do so, right? It's not that, oh, some forms of murder are okay because some culture sanctioned it. No, these certain actions, the immoral actions, we want to say those are wrong in all places, in all times, in all cultures. And if moral relativism is true, then we can't do that. So philosophers, when we think part of the idea of doing moral philosophy, you take an idea and you think about its implications. You follow this idea through, and you see what conclusions you draw from it. And if those conclusions are false or contradict with other beliefs we have, then we have to reject the idea. So what follows from moral relativism is a conception of morality which is very different from the conception of morality that we want to have. We want to be able to say some actions are right and some are wrong, and we can't do that if cultural relativism is true. So we are rejecting culture as being the determining factor in what's right and wrong. Now, just before we end our discussion on culture, it's worth noting that people do learn their moral rules from their culture. It's not to discount the role of culture in teaching people about morality, but it's to say when we want to determine what is right and what is wrong, we don't look to culture. When we want to determine what is right and what is wrong, we have to try and think about objective, impartial reasons that give equal consideration to everyone's interests. Remember that minimum conception of morality from last chapter. We don't look to our culture to determine what's right and wrong. We try and provide reasons. Sometimes those reasons agree with our current cultural standards, sometimes they disagree. But that's what philosophy is all about, looking to try and provide reasons for our beliefs about what's right and wrong.